Good morning, everybody, and hopefully you can hear me. Welcome to those of you that haven't been to one of our Pimento networking Zoom events before. This, in fact, is our 25th weekly event, and we're very pleased to be here today at Future Focus. Our presentations are in association with the Alliance of Independent Agencies. For those that don't know Pimento, Pimento is a marketing services network. We're a virtual network. We've been around for 16 years now. We have some 200 independent agencies and 5,500 marketing specialists working with us right across the UK. And what we do is we create teams by taking the talent that's required on a particular project or opportunity and then molding them into a team to answer a particular client brief. And we've got over 100 different marketing services and disciplines within that network. And we've, as I say, been doing this virtually for 15 years. So if you're a client on this call today, or indeed if you're an agency and you're interested to know a little bit more about Pimento, please don't hesitate to contact us after this call. You can go to the expo and you'll see that there's a Pimento expo area where you'll be able to download more information. And equally too, if you go to our website, that's pimento.co.uk, you'll equally be able to get more information there. So it's good to see so many members joining us this morning already. We're up to 22, 23. As in our normal calls, we will have time to answer questions at the end of the call. So I'll hand over shortly to Andrew Cooper. But before I do that, to just remind you that, yes, you can answer questions. On the right-hand side of your screen, you'll see there's a chat function. If you start typing at any point during the call, I'll be able to go back to those and pose questions to Andrew after his presentation. There'll also be a video of today's call, which will be posted on the Pimento Agency YouTube channel after today, and also you will be able to see this video on the Future Focus website. So lots to talk about today. Quick update really on COVID. We do this every week to put this presentation in context, and most of you I'm sure are up to the minute news viewers, so you're pretty aware of where we sit, but we're certainly facing some enormous challenges at the moment when it comes to testing. I've spoken to a number of our members this week who've told me that their children gone back to school for 5 minutes and they're back home again already because they've either suffered from those typical childhood colds and are being signed off. And that's obviously impacting on our ability to get people back into the office too. So far we've had, I think, yesterday 3,105 new cases confirmed. The NHS are beginning to cancel operations again and turn away patients as the crisis develops. And, you know, as I say, schools that opened just a week ago are having to close classes or year groups with suspected cases and no ability to get people tested. So it's a bit of a bugger's muddle. And in turn, obviously, that's impacting on us as parents. And this weekend, we've got universities returning and colleges returning too. So one can only imagine this situation is going to get worse rather than better. So why is all that relevant to today's presentation? Well, behind the news is a huge amount of data, and data that basically should have, and presumably did, inform government, local authorities and businesses of the return of the second wave and when that was likely to hit. And in fact, in June, for those of you that were on our calls in June, we predicted when this was going to happen. I think pretty much to the day when we were going to see an uptick in the rise with the modelling work that was undertaken by Pimento agency Red Cellar. So by way of a really good link, I'm extremely pleased to be able to introduce Andrew Cooper, Lord Cooper of Windrush. Andrew is the founder and president of the research and strategy consultancy Populous, where he advises a very broad range of different clients, both businesses, organisations, and still political organisations and campaigners. He served as director of strategy for David Cameron for 3 years in the Conservative Liberal Democratic Coalition government. He was a senior advisor in the 2010 and 2015 UK general elections, the 2016 Scottish Parliament elections, and the No campaign in 2014 and the referendum in Scotland. And he was also actively involved in the Remain campaign in 2016 for UK's membership of the EU. He was appointed to the House of Lords in 2014, where he sits with no political affiliation. So we can all talk from whatever political divide or where we come from today, and is, as you say, Lord Cooper of Windrush. Good morning, Andrew. Welcome, and thank you very much for agreeing to talk today and share your insights.
Good morning. Good morning, Stephen. Thank you very much. I'm going to actually come on to talk a bit about COVID, which you referenced just then, but shall I, I'll try and share my screen and then I'll get cracking. I hope people will. Can you see that, Stephen?
It's just coming up now, sir. Here we are. Yeah.
Okay. So it's a very bold title. What I'm going to take you through is a model which we've created to help us to analyse the patterns and the kind of the structure of elections, which tells us a great deal, not just about politics, but actually about our country, about our society, about people's feelings about many things beyond just politics. And certainly I think it helps give us some insights into the trajectory that we're headed on as a country, things which will be defining us in the future. So to start off with, just to introduce you to the model, we call this the clock face because we give the people at the different hours of the clock in terms of thinking where people are on it. But just to explain it, it's a very robust model because it's built not on poll data, but on census. Census is done, 5% of it is published at an individual level, anonymised. So this is based on the building blocks of the model. Is 2.8 million people's individual level census data responses, anonymised. And what we've done by process of trial and error and experimentation, we've discovered a way of organising all of that census data into 2 dimensions. And the bit just to internalise before we crack on through it, the 2 dimensions, the 2 axes, we sum up as security and diversity. Security, the vertical axis, is essentially the census data responses that relate to economic security and well-being. So it's things like income, occupation, housing tenure, health, educational attainment, social group, and so on. All of those factors relating to economic security collapse into a single axis. And then the horizontal axis we call diversity, which is essentially the census data responses that relate to how urban or rural and how ethnically diverse is the postcode where you live, how densely populated it is, and also age is a component of that axis too. And all those factors, again, are collapsed into a single variable. So you have a vertical axis of security, low to high, and a horizontal axis of diversity, low to high, right to left as you look at it. And then what we discovered is that actually when you look at the country in that way, we create this kind of 4-quadrant, 2-dimensional map of the country, which actually turns out to reveal we've got break into 4 quite neat quadrants defined by how low and high we are on the 2 different axes. So there's thumbnail sketches there, I won't read all of those words, but for example, people in the top right who are defined by being both high on economic security factors and low on diversity factors are archetypally relatively well off, typically business owners and managers. They're typically living in community towns and villages. That's the traditional heartland of the Conservative Party, whereas, for example, bottom left, people defined by living in places that are very high diversity and who themselves are very low on economic security measures, much more likely to have left-leaning economic values and different views on public spending, for example. But if we then put politics onto it, what this is showing you is on that model, on those two dimensions, you can see where some of the demographic factors fall out. But what we've put on here is statistically the centroid, the average demographic profile at the intersection of those 2 axes of people who voted for those political parties in the 2015 election. So at this point, it's capturing, in quite a kind of graphically simple way, I think, something which is intuitively true about the traditional left-right model of politics, which is that your average Conservative voter in 2015 is someone who's really quite high on the economic security measures and quite low on the diversity measures. Your average Labour voter is kind of the opposite. They're much lower on economic security, much higher on diversity, living somewhere much more densely populated and diverse. It tells us something interesting about British politics and about that election, which was defined by the Conservatives taking a lot of seats from the Liberal Democrats and getting a surprise majority. that the Lib Dem voter on average on that line between Labour and the Conservatives is actually much closer to the Conservatives, which is not a commentary point on the Lib Dems. It's a neutral demographic observation on the structure of their vote being more like the Tory vote, which kind of explains what happened in that election. It also tells us something instructive, that the average person who voted for UKIP in 2015, which 1 in 8 people did, is about as non-diverse as the average Conservative voter and about as economically insecure as the average Labour voter. While the average Green voter was only 3 to 4% in 2015, but an interestingly homogeneous, demographically coherent vote, with the Greens very over-indexing the bits of the country that are defined by being both well off economically and diverse, more urban. So if we then look at it at a constituency level, I'm going to move into close-up. On this chart showing you every constituency in England and Wales in 2015, the blue dots are seats won by the Tories, the red dots are seats won by Labour, the yellow dots are seats won by any other party. And you can see at a glance the extent to which the Labour Party and the Conservative Party have very clearly delineated demographic heartlands that they each dominate, with the Conservatives in 2015 winning almost every constituency that is both high in economic security and low in diversity. Labour winning almost every constituency that is defined by being both low in economic security and high in diversity. And the kind of battle line where the two heartlands meet in the middle, indicated by that line, that's where we find the contested territory, that's where we find the battleground, that's where we find the marginal seats, the seats that changed hands in that election, for the most part scattering either side of that line. One footnote as we look at that chart, that the yellow dot in the bottom right, the kind of outlier, is interestingly the constituency of Clacton, which in 2015 was the only constituency that the UK Independence Party won. So that's what 2015 looked like, and that's the traditional sort of model of a left-right structure of politics, with the centre-right party dominating the bits of the country that are well off and non-diverse, the centre-left party dominating the bits of the country that are less well off and much more diverse. But then we flip forward 12 months to the Brexit referendum, and we see something really interesting. It's the same model again. This is not poll data. This is results mapped onto our demographic model. On this chart, the yellowy orange dots are constituencies that voted to remain. The green teal dots are constituencies that voted to leave. But the thing which is instantly striking about that is that the axis is completely rotated. If we compare it with the previous chart, the battle line in 2015 was running from the top left to the bottom right, but in 2016 it was running from the bottom left to the top right. And what that means is the demographics of the Brexit issue operate on a different plane than the demographics of traditional party politics in the UK, and the battle line of Brexit therefore cuts right through the heartland of the Conservative Party in the top right and right through the heartland of the Labour Party in the bottom left. And that's how Brexit, as it were, kind of broke British politics, at least for a period. And we could debate the ways in which the two parties responded to that, but the fact that Brexit cut right through the traditional demographic structure, heartland of the parties, isn't really their fault. It's a function of the different demographics at play with that issue, which I'll move on to. And then we looked at lots of other countries. This is just one example. We've looked at multiple countries, and what we're finding is essentially the same dynamics are in play in every developed economy that we've looked at. This is the United States of America in 2016, Trump v Clinton. This chart's showing you on the same model. Again, it's US census data with results mapped onto it, and this is showing you every county in the United States sized by population. And at a glance, you can see, firstly, it's the same axis as Brexit. The battle line is bottom left to the top right. And you can see at a glance that Hillary Clinton's support is coming overwhelmingly from places towards the top left, bits of America that are defined by being both economically secure and diverse, and their big bubble also, so her folks coming from densely populated cities. Whereas Trump supporters, you can see, predominantly coming from the bits of America that are much less economically secure and much less diverse, with that very long tail off into the bottom right of tiny dots of very poor, very poorly educated, very rural, very white counties.
Andrew,
And if we look underneath this,
Andrew, sorry to interrupt you, it's Stephen here. I really don't want to interrupt you. We're getting a huge amount of feedback from your end. We've tried to close it down, etc. I don't know whether you've got a microphone or whether you are just talking into your computer, but it comes and goes. I'm not sure what one can do about it.
I'm talking into my computer, and I don't have anything else on. The fan is going on my computer, which is nothing I can do about it. Maybe that.
Okay, I think perhaps maybe just turn your sound down on your computer. Maybe that might help. But there's not much more we can do about it. Apologies for interrupting you.
That's all right. This chart's showing you some polling which helps to explain what's happening in the UK and in the US and some of these longer range factors. So this is from two very large sample polls that we conducted. 12,000 people interviewed on the day of the US presidential election in 2016 after they had voted, and 12,000 people interviewed on the day of the Brexit referendum in the UK in 2016 after they had voted. And it was a big poll with lots of other things, but this question really leaps out because it goes to sort of worldview and core values rather than just people's views on that specific vote that they were facing on that day. And what this chart is telling us is that if in that poll you said that you think that all of these 7 things, multiculturalism, social liberalism, immigration, the green movement, feminism, globalization, the internet, if you said in that poll you think all of those things are a force for ill in the world, as opposed to a force for good or a mixed blessing, there is an almost 0% chance that you, sorry, for force for ill, there's almost 100% chance that you said that you voted for Donald Trump, or that you also said in the poll that you voted to leave the EU. And if you said that you think all those 7 things are a force for good, there is an almost 0% chance that you voted for Trump or for Brexit. Now, that be clear, that isn't saying that everybody who voted leave or everybody who voted for Trump thinks those things, but it is saying that more or less everybody who thinks those things voted for Donald Trump and voted for Brexit. And as you can see, there's a bit of statistical noise in there, but basically the lines are on top of each other. So in other words, both the demographics of Trump and Brexit look very alike, that bottom right of our model, but also the underlying attitudinal drivers look very similar. And I think that tells us something significant, because what it means is that for most people voting for Trump or Clinton, and most people voting Leave or Remain, the issue went beyond just the question, the Brexit referendum, it went beyond the question just of what our relationship should be with the EU. For many people on both sides, that vote was a proxy for a broader set of core values and worldview and kind of feelings about all the ways in which the world has changed over the last 20 or 30 years. And then we tracked back in America and wondered, when did this start? Has it always been so? And actually, it hasn't always been so. So we went back as far as 1980. Back in 1980, Ronald Reagan, the Republican candidate, is getting his support from where traditionally the centre-right would, the bits of America that are both well-off and non-diverse. He beats Carter, whose support is coming from where you would expect the centre-left party's support to come from, the bits of the country that are much less secure and much more diverse. But as you can see, around the mid-1990s, the axis started to rotate, and the average Republican voter in the US becoming steadily, in each cycle, less economically secure, on average a bit less healthy, a bit less well-educated, and even less diverse, in a country that over that period has become quite a lot more diverse, while the average Democrat voter is moving the other way. In the election of 2000, when George W. Bush very narrowly beat Vice President Gore, for the first time the Republican vote tipped from the top right into the bottom right, and the Democrats from the bottom left to the top left. And this pattern's been going on since the mid-1990s. So Trump winning in the way that he did shouldn't have been the surprise that it was to many people. And then we look back at the UK and wonder, well, if the same rotation is happening here, which is revealed by the Brexit referendum result, when did that start? And this chart is showing us that actually, beneath the surface in ways I think that we couldn't really have seen at the time, the seeds of this were starting to happen in the UK also in the mid-1990s. And this chart is starting with Labour's high watermark of 1997, when they got 45% of the vote and a landslide of nearly 200 majority. And what we looked at was the pattern of the erosion of that vote as Labour came down from the high watermark. to see whether the vote was just sort of falling evenly as it came down, and it isn't. And this chart's showing you the relationship between stopping voting Labour between 1997 and 2015, and the proportion of people in each constituency who, in the census, define their national identity as English only, not British, or Welsh only, not British. And as you can see, there's an incredibly strong correlation, and defining your national identity as English only, not British, is one of the strongest predictors of subsequently voting to leave the European Union. So before we could kind of see it above the surface, which didn't really happen until the 2016 Brexit referendum, below the surface of British politics, the same axis rotation was happening as we've observed in the United States. And in the 2017 election, the first election after the Brexit election, 1 year later, when Theresa May sought a majority for Brexit and lost her majority, this chart is showing you on our model the constituencies where the Conservative vote went up the most. And as you can see, with the exception being Sheffield Hallam, all the other seats where the Tory vote went up are in that Brexit part of the map. And in 2019, the general election last year, Kensington is an outlier where you had a very close contest between Labour and the Liberal Democrats, and the Conservatives came through the middle. But all of the other constituencies that the Conservatives gained in that election to get their big majority, indicated by the blue dots, they're all down in the bottom right, towards the bottom right of our model, in the bits of Britain that voted for Brexit. And essentially, since the referendum, the only places where the Conservatives have been gaining votes was in the bits of Britain that voted for Brexit. And we can see that clearly in this chart, which shows you the average position of people voting for each of these parties since 2010. And you can see there a really significant shift, a big rotation in the axis since 2015, because of the forces which Brexit sort of unleashed. And the Conservative, average Conservative voter in 2010 and 2015 was about 1:30 on our clock. And by 2019, just 4 years on from the 2015 election, is almost 3 o'clock. The Labour vote also rotated, but not by as much, which is principally because Labour took a more ambivalent position on Brexit. Faced with the challenge of the demographics of Brexit cutting through their demographic foundation, the Conservatives responded essentially by becoming a Brexit party, and Labour handled the same challenge by essentially trying to fudge it. And by 2019, we're in a position where they weren't Brexity enough for the bit of their heartland that was pro-Brexit, and they also weren't Remainy enough for the bit of their heartland that was pro-Remain, and they got squeezed. So we then map other dimensions of the model, and you can start to see how this goes beyond politics and starts to give us some pointers about the country and about how people feel about other things. The first of those was, some of you may remember this was probably now 8 or 9 years ago, the BBC did a programme called the Big Personality Test in association with Cambridge University, which involved about 600,000 people, went to the BBC website and took a Cambridge University psychological typology questionnaire. And we plotted that data, and you can see here that the centroids of the different psychological archetypes, and it's very interesting how differently they disperse and how different psychological archetypes sit beneath these two axes of security and diversity. We've now got an algorithm so we can plot survey data onto the same model, so some examples of that. Very different qualities and traits that people admire. If you think about that, not just in terms of political leadership, but business leadership, business brands, very different traits that are appealing to people on the basis of how they sit on these two axes of security and diversity. When we ask people specifically about brands, we work with quite a lot of clients who have decided that they would like consumers to think of them as innovative, for example, but actually, as you can see here, innovative is a brand attribute which only appeals to a certain type of person. Whereas, for example, in the bottom right of the model, if you're someone who's less economically secure and living somewhere much less diverse, you're much more likely to value tradition than innovation. And it's instructive, the right in the middle there, reliability. That means that's something which has a kind of universal brand appeal. It's a universal hygiene factor that we all want wherever we sit on these two axes that divide us in other ways. Lots of businesses are understandably thinking and talking about social purpose, and there's a consensus in the country among consumers that they want businesses to have social purposes. But when we ask them what should the priorities be for business as they think about their social purpose, as you see, there's a huge dispersal here, and quite different priorities depending on where consumers are sitting on this map. So, for example, quite a lot of businesses have decided that environmental sustainability is an important part of their social purpose, which is completely understandable, but actually isn't something that necessarily resonates with more than a quite specific cluster of consumers. It's also interesting that this chart, the dispersal on this is much more about where you sit on the diversity axis than where you sit on the security axis. So in other words, people having quite similar views, regardless of how well off they are, determined by how diverse the place they live is. We'll come back to that point. We can plot news sources. That tells a pretty intuitive story about where people say they get their news from each week. But in a very kind of atomized media world, it helps explain why people see the same things in such different ways. The BBC News sits there basically bang in the middle. It's the reliability equivalent. It's the kind of default that appeals to almost everybody roughly equally. And this chart's showing people's favourite TV shows on the same basis, and the BBC equivalent here, the universal factor, is Love Island. If the UK was a TV show, it would be Love Island, which is not at all, of course, saying that everybody likes Love Island, but it's observing that in a country that's quite significantly divided and polarised on some issues between the top right and the bottom left, and on economic issues, and increasingly between the top left and the bottom right on cultural issues, in whichever of those four quadrants you sit, you're roughly equally likely to find something that makes sense to you in Love Island that you can relate to. Whereas, for example, The Handmaid's Tale has a very particular demographic appeal way up in the top left. This is Black Mirror. Mrs. Brown's Boys, on the other hand, much more down in the bottom right. The Crown in the top right, as you might expect. Now looking at COVID, there are some things about COVID that actually do more or less unite us. What we're looking at here is heat maps, where the darker the colour, the stronger the agreement with the statement that we're mapping onto this model. So people who think the NHS is handling coronavirus very well, almost everybody in the country thinks that. Slightly more light blue in the top right, which is where you find people who are more likely to question the NHS as a construct, as an institution. But the country as a whole, through all of this, we're pretty united about that. But we divide on other things. So on the question of whether COVID shows that the UK has a major problem with inequality, really quite a clear split there. Down the middle of our model, people to the left, regardless of their own economic security, broadly agreeing that this does show we have an inequality problem, and people to the right, particularly the top right, much less likely to think that. Do we think the UK has responded well or badly compared with other countries that we can observe? Well, that's pretty much mapping on a kind of 2019 election political line. It's almost like a kind of party vote proxy. People who didn't vote Conservative thinking the UK response has been bad compared with other countries. People who did vote Tory much more likely think that the response has been good. And when we ask about lockdown restrictions and whether people think they're easing too soon, people towards the bottom left and a little bit in the bottom right are much more likely to think that restrictions are easing too soon, whereas people in the top right much more likely to be comfortable with what's happening. And some of those factors split on an economic line. So support for the government response and optimism about return to normality versus the opposite, is the top right versus bottom left. People in the top right are much less likely to be concerned about the health and financial implications of COVID than people in the bottom left are. But people in the top right are much more likely to be concerned about the future of airlines and to support financial aid to airlines and indeed to banks. And to see less of a role for brands. People in the bottom left much more likely to see a role for brands, and very strongly supportive of government financial support for people and companies, much more likely to think that the furlough scheme should be continued. And then there are other aspects of COVID which split on the other axis, on the cultural axis, between the top left and the bottom right. So people in the top left of our model, people who are defined by being both high on economic security and low and high in diversity, much more likely to think that the government should follow the scientific advice, that it should put health and safety above all, ahead of the economy. They're much more likely to think the media has been responsible in its coverage, whereas people in the bottom right much more likely to think the media has been scaremongering. People in the top left are much more likely to wear masks, and people in the bottom right much less likely to do so. And when we model the places where people have been cautioned for breaching social distancing rules, we're much more likely to find those in the bottom right too. The top left people are much more concerned about travelling abroad, the survival of sort of going out places, whereas people in the bottom right much less worried about that, much more worried about relationships with friends and family, and they're also much more likely to look to trusted British brands at this moment. So a few quick thoughts as we look into the future, and then take any points and questions people might have. Firstly, the rotation of the axis means that we are increasingly divided by cultural values and less than by economics. And this is one example. This question, a poll question, is asking, looking at those 6 things, addressing income equality, racial equality, religious tolerance, female equality, LGBT plus equality, and gender self-identity, do you think that too much, too little, or about enough has been done in each of those areas? And the block in the middle is telling us that as a country, overall, on average, most people think enough has been done on religious tolerance, racial equality, female equality, and LGBT plus equality, too much on gender self-identity, and not enough on income inequality. But when we look at it in the context of the 4 quadrants, we see a very different picture, where the top right and the bottom right agree that not enough has been done on income inequality, about enough on racial equality and religious tolerance, but too much has been done on female equality as well as on LGBT plus equality and gender self-identity. Whereas people in the top left and the bottom left, so regardless of their economic security, they agree that not enough has been done in any of those areas. We're going to see more and more of those divides between the left of the map and the right, issues defined by diversity, not economic security, because of the rotation of the demographic axis of our politics. Another thing we can observe is that the underlying factors which relate to supporting Brexit also correlate very strongly with the vulnerability to losing jobs to automation and robotics and AI. This chart's showing you that the higher the Leave vote, this is mapping local government wards, the higher the Leave vote at ward level, the greater the risk of losing jobs to automation, on the basis of looking at the infrastructure of those wards and the qualifications and skills of the people who live in them. And we looked earlier at the kind of underlying values drivers that sat behind people's decision as to how to vote between Trump and Clinton and Remain and Leave. But a really important factor as we think about the future is that there's a huge generational gulf on those things. This chart is showing you the net positivity among under 45s, the orangey bars going up, versus the negativity among over 55s and the blue bars going down on multiculturalism, on international versus nationalism, on measures to promote equality for ethnic minorities, on gay marriage, diversity, human rights, immigration, free movement, and voting Remain. And those are huge, huge net differences in worldview. And they're important because those differences aren't about a life stage, they're a cohort effect. So the reason why under 45s have such a different view on these things is because they were overwhelmingly born since the mid-1970s, mostly much more recently. They mostly became adults in the early to mid-1990s, much more recently in most cases. And so the only reality they've known is post-Cold War, after the Berlin Wall has come down, the era of the internet, after the introduction of free movement in the Maastricht Treaty, and therefore much more migration across Europe and around the world, the opening up of the world to globalization, the internet era, a period of massive, rapid social change. And unsurprisingly, most people whose only reality that has been view most of those things as net positives. Whereas I think equally intuitively, people 20, 30 years older than that have found the same things very disruptive and make them feel insecure culturally and economically. But the significance of that point is that if it is a cohort effect, then the centre of gravity of these things will continue to move more towards the view of under 45s. Someone who's today in their 30s and 40s and who thinks that immigration and multiculturalism are positive things, are very unlikely to change their mind about those things when they get into their 50s, 60s and 70s. So the balance of view in the country is going to start to change as we go forward. And so finally, just a few sort of points to rest on, some of them perhaps a bit contentious, a few observations. This is picking up on the famous Donald Rumsfeld quote that there are things we know, and there are known unknowns, things that we don't know, as well as the things we don't know. So some things that we know. Growing demographic diversity will continue to change the structure of our politics, and the centre of gravity will become more liberal and more internationalist. So the question is, does the axis continue to rotate? In other words, does the Conservative vote, on average, follow the trajectory that we observe in America and can move down from sort of 3 o'clock down into the bottom right, or does it stay where it is? Secondly, the government's levelling up agenda, which was very effective electorally in December 2019, was obviously perceived pre-COVID, and levelling up presupposes that you've got money to spend. So there's an interesting question now what the Conservative government's economic narrative now will be, and what is the economic story? Brexit sort of united the top right and the bottom right last year, the desire to get Brexit done. But once Brexit is done, what are the economics that can unite the top right, where people are quite well off, and the bottom right, people who are much less well off? Obviously, the financial cost of COVID, combined with endemic pressure on public spending, means we're entering a period of rising taxes, for which there's very little public support. So who pays will be a massive debate in this Parliament and beyond. As someone on the Remain side, I observe the Brexit that we're likely to get seems very likely to fall a lot short of what was actually promised. And there's an interesting question of what happens when Brexit doesn't transform the lives and opportunities in the way that people who voted for it believe that it would. If Brexit isn't the solution to people who are struggling in the bottom right, what is, and who pays the penalty for that? Labour fundamentally ended up losing the last election in large part because its demographic coalition was the wrong shape and straddling both the most strongly Remain and the most strongly Leave parts of the country. So there's a question of, can they rebuild that coalition? If you're Keir Starmer, what do? Do you try to win back very Brexit seats you lost, or do you move up and become much more singularly sort of top left-based party? A consistent majority, the polls have told us now for 18 months or more, think that Brexit's a mistake, and because of the trajectory of the country in terms of its demographics, that majority is going to rise. So there's a question of when rejoining the EU moves on to the mainstream political agenda. 2/3 of under 40s already think we should rejoin the EU. The changing structure will also mean that the fiscal and spending imbalance between generations will grow in political salience, and I don't think politicians have figured out how to address that. We looked at that chart showing support for the NHS through COVID, and that cemented the NHS even further as the UK secular religion, which makes reforming it even more difficult, even though the funding structure is probably unsustainable. And alongside that, we have to fix the broken social care system, which will no doubt be one of the scandals that comes out of the inevitable inquiry into COVID. The changing structure of our population will mean that climate change will become an increasingly potent political issue, with growing pressure on the government to meet its carbon targets sooner, but it's still not clear how we achieve that and where we then get our energy from. And the next wave of globalisation and the impact of automation will basically double down in terms of who it negatively affects. So the drivers of the disruption that we've experienced, the disruption which ended up in Trump in America and Brexit in this country, and which characterise most Western democracies, are very likely to continue, not to go away. I will stop there. I'm very happy to take any points or any questions that anyone may have.
Andrew, thank you very much indeed. I mean, a huge amount of data to digest, and equally at the same time, quite a sort of, I guess, in many respects, a worrying outlook politically, socially, and economically. One question I've got here from Rebecca Dye, first away, is to what extent do you feel that the polarizing nature of social media is culpable for the increasing polarization of society?
It's certainly a feature of it. I mean, I think there's a sort of chicken egg issue here, but certainly the fact that that we don't any longer all share our news in the same place means that more and more people are able to essentially only ever hear points of view that they share, and that clearly is further polarizes and further drives wedges between us, because it's not just that we have different views about a shared set of facts, it's that people are seeing a completely different set of facts. There's a famous quote from Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan, US writer and policymaker and senator, who coined the phrase that you're entitled to your own opinions but not your own facts. And the problem with atomization of social media is people sort of get to the point where they feel they are entitled to their own facts, and it's impossible to have a kind of shared conversation and a common discourse, which we desperately need in order to resolve some of the difficult challenges we face, and to do so in a way that brings the country together.
The demise of particularly amongst obviously younger readers of independent press or even frankly a press that represents all the quadrants you've shown, with fact-led insightful journalism seems to be also a big issue. One of the other questions that was coming from Paul Hackett was relating to proportional representation, whether it's ever likely to feature in a future parliamentary model. Do you have a view on that?
It's it's a polarizing issue. I don't currently see any momentum for it. There was a period where it looked quite likely. I think the fact that once you have parties starting to win majorities under the current system, but what that does is essentially tries to squeeze people of quite different views into a system which is basically dominated by two parties being dissatisfied, which is a feature of our politics at the moment, that a lot of people who live in the top left of our model don't really feel there's any party that confidently represents them. A lot of those people are hoping that that's what Keir Starmer will choose to do with the Labour Party, but it's not clear that he will. So the longer that kind of vacuum remains, the longer that we have a system where millions of people feel that they're not represented under the current system, the more support for PR potentially grows. But as I say, there's currently no real momentum for that I see.
And you look at it, this is a perfect opportunity for the Liberals to come through the centre as people become more liberal in their views, yet they don't seem to be taking up that challenge.
Well, the Liberal Democrats, if you recall, in December last year, they made quite a bold play to try to basically become the Remain party. They fought an essentially single-issue election campaign on that, trying to command that vote in the top left of our model that feels unrepresented, and it didn't work. They got squeezed. Unfortunately, one of the features demanded by our system is leaders. Leaders define parties, people get drawn to leaders, and I'm afraid it's hard to see at the moment the Liberal Democrats beginning to come up with a leader who's capable of kind of commanding support to gain the momentum again. But in terms of the structure of politics, there is a big space there which kind of intellectually should be natural territory for the Liberal Democrats.
I guess the other thing I think is fascinating is that, obviously both on a global basis as well as a local basis, this kind of division, far left, far right. You don't have the data, I guess, from the 1920s to hand, but if you were able to get hold of that data, would you think you would be looking at a similar picture?
I mean, what we haven't covered every country, obviously. So far, we've applied this model to France, Spain, Germany, Italy, US, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, Belgium, Netherlands, and every country you're seeing essentially the same dynamics happening. Germany, we can draw a historical comparison along the lines you're alluding to, because when we map Germany on this model, we find that support for the AfD, which is the nationalist populist party in Germany, exists in the bottom right, exactly as it does in other countries. And when we look at where those places are in Germany, they are essentially exactly the same places that were most strongly voting for the Nazis in the 1930s, which is extraordinary, really. But the same combination of demographics of non-diversity, being a long way from cities, which more than ever, the urban hubs of a modern economy, and being less educated and less well off are the factors that combine. But we're seeing essentially the same dynamic everywhere, and mainstream centre-left and centre-right parties being pulled to extremes or being challenged by more extreme parties, and this polarity driven by rotation that's between the top left and the bottom right.
Yes, but back to Rebecca Dye's point earlier on about social media in general being both potentially a force for evil as well as a force for good. One would hope, I guess, the big difference between the 1920s and where we live now is that actually there are more, people are more able to engage around and more able to voice their point of view. I guess the issue is the point you made earlier on about basically people essentially making up their own facts as they go along, and talking in an echo chamber, and not really exploring the points of view of the broader audience. It wasn't really a question; it was just kind of an observation. In terms of if you were advising Labour now, and in terms of what they could do in order to be able to capture the hearts and minds of the UK populace as we move to the next election, obviously that's a fair way out at the moment, what would you be advising them to do?
Well, I think the underlying, I see some of the chat comments sort of go to this point. I think the underlying issue is the reason that we got into this situation is because there are people in the bottom right of our model who are essentially the people who've been losers because of globalization. People with old skills or no skills or wrong skills, and have seen this succession of changes through globalization that have threatened their economic security and made them feel culturally unsettled and threatened. And we saw that, for example, in the rising salience of immigration as an issue. And what happened, I think, is that politicians sort of pandered to that a bit and patronised it a bit, but they didn't really do anything about it. And we ended up in a situation where people living in some very poor communities in Britain who are very much, I think the diversity point's interesting because it's also about this disconnection. People who live in small, relatively rural places, small towns, they are often physically disconnected from cities that are the hubs of a network global economy. And we sort of observed that happening, all the parties observed that happening, we didn't do anything about it. So I think the challenge for all the parties, but particularly for the Labour Party, is rather than try to flirt with the Brexitiness of people in the bottom right, it is just to work out, well, what is the solution? I mean, my personal, if we take Clacton, which was the outlier right at the bottom right, voted for UKIP in 2015, very strongly for Brexit. It's a very poor, essentially economically dying community. It voted for Brexit in the hope that Brexit would save it, a town that is 99.2% English born white. My personal view is Brexit will end up making their life harder, not easier, and it won't solve any of the reasons why they have those problems. So the question is, which I think Keir Starmer needs to think about, is if Brexit isn't the answer to Clacton, what is? What is the combination of economic investment in infrastructure, in training? I think transport infrastructure is a big part of this. If you connect Clacton, the high-speed rail line into London, you turn it into a commuter town and you suddenly rejuvenate it economically. But I think we need to think about that, and I think it's only when we do that, actually, that we're really going to be able to succeed in trying to bring the country back together again.
Very, very tactical and very local, isn't it? When local politics really needs to come through in order to identify those opportunities. But equally, too, with AI and the march isn't going to stop, then those people will continue to be marginalised, I guess, and find it even more difficult to get jobs. There have been conversations, and we've seen this through the furlough programme. If you actually pay people to stay at home in situations where there is no work, but you just give them the opportunity to basically have a life and actually engage with society, then actually there is potentially a way in which you can create a sort of full employment situation and create some degree of basic wealth.
Yes, and to try to break the generational cycle, because a risk of that second wave of globalization and of automation and AI and robotics is adults in the Clactons of the world who have lost faith in the ability of our economy to benefit them and feel disconnected from the country's success, that then is passed on to their children, because they end up with skills that no longer are viable in a modern economy. So I think we need to take a very ambitious view of that, and I agree. I mean, if we're spending billions of pounds to make people stay at home, why not spend billions of pounds to train them, to give them skills which will be useful in the economy of the future?
Well, listen, I think we are unfortunately running out of time now. If there's any final questions, please drop them into the chat box now. We've probably got about another 5 minutes before we have to sign off. Okay, if I missed anybody, hang on. A comment from Owen Cater. Does this polarisation mean that consensus politics is going to be ever harder to achieve?
Yes, it does. And to the point made earlier about social media, having different conversations, Brexit was incredibly polarising because, as I said, it was a proxy for the core values worldview, and I'm sure many of people on this call have the experience of struggling to understand the other person's point of view because we're starting in such different places. So there's a real risk that we remain deeply polarised. I think it's, at the moment, because of the loss of confidence in our political parties, most people in the UK identify their political position much more strongly by reference to their Brexit position as a Remainer or a Leaver than they do by reference to any political party. So that sort of digs it even deeper. We somehow have to find a way to move beyond that, particularly because I think some of the really big challenges we face, like how are we going to fix the social care system? The reason that hasn't been fixed is because it's bloody difficult, and there isn't a costless, painless, no-loser option way of doing it. So it's essential that we find a way to bring the country together so we can have some consensus about some of these very difficult decisions. Otherwise, we'll never be able to fix them.
Okay, and the final question, and I think it's one reasonably close to all our hearts. It impacts on all of us, I guess, which is who's going to win the US election?
We used this model in 2016 to identify and we didn't have the confidence to say Trump's going to win, but we presented data to clients saying the probability of Trump winning is much more like 50-50 than the 20% which the markets have on it. The markets now have it. The betting markets actually have it nearly 50-50. The analysts have it kind of 30% chance of Trump. I mean, if we believe the polls, Trump is so far underwater in so many places that he can't win. If we look where he's spending his money, he's spending all of his advertising money in what should be very safe Republican precincts in very safe Republican states. So his campaign thinks he's losing. We can certainly observe that. Well, what Trump wants to do, obviously, is he wants to announce that he's got a vaccine, declare COVID defeated, and try to make the election all about the economy, where he still has a lead over Biden, and about law and order. And if he succeeds in doing that, then it's likely to be much closer than it looks. But I think if one had to take a punt now, you would say Joe Biden is going to win.
And presumably adding to that too, kind of the international opportunities to be able to claim some sort of foreign policy decisions, witnessing what's been happening this week in the Middle East as kind of a victory in order to be able to demonstrate it's not just about...
Yeah, try to make himself look a bit more like a statesman, a bit less like a psychopath.
Yeah, I mean, the interesting thing is it doesn't really matter whether he achieves all of those things because ultimately he'll claim them.
Sorry?
So it doesn't matter if he achieves all of that long list of things in terms of actually cracking COVID and so on, because he will still claim it.
Yes.
Yeah.
At the moment, the poll data suggests that not only is he not gaining support and sort of winning new supporters, but he's lost quite a chunk of what he had before, particularly in the suburbs, and that will be enough to take the election away from him. But the other thing we can safely predict is if he loses, he's not going to be a good loser, he's not going to be a gracious loser, and we could end up with several days of chaos before the result is completely clear or before he accepts it.
Be like a sort of Latin American election, I suspect, in that respect. Well, once again, thank you very much for your time. Really, really helpful and very, very insightful. We will be sharing the slides with everyone who's been on the call today, and also the video, so that actually you've got the words to go with the pictures. Apologies for some of the sound quality. I couldn't figure out what was going on there. But thank you once again for joining us. Enjoy the rest of your day, and go to as many sessions as you possibly can. And as I say, if you're interested in talking more, do drop me a line at Pimento. And thank you once again. Goodbye.
Thank you.